Okay.
Hello and welcome to XL Catlin Arctic Live, broadcasting from the UK Arctic Research Station here in Ny-Ålesund on Svalbard. Very, very pleased to have Nick Scott join me, part of the plastics research team here in the Arctic and currently at the University of Exeter. We've had a great day so far exploring the topic of microplastics, and we'll be doing that further in this session. After the session, in 2 hours' time, we have the final open Q&A, the final Ask Me Anything session for today. And then tomorrow we will be having Ellie talking about science communications and some of her adventures, as well as looking at sea ice and other types of ice that you might find in the Arctic. But Nick, thank you very, very much for being part of today's session. It's the second time you've been on, and a big welcome to schools that we have joining from the USA and Canada. We're just going to get the live chat up. What we're going to do is we're going to split this into a few sections. First of all, I'm going to chat to Nick about some of his background and how you got from growing up in southwest England to the Arctic, that journey. Then we'll take some of the pre-submitted questions, and then we'll come and join in the live chat. I'm not quite picking it up yet, so we'll just come in here and see if that renews. Ellie, I'm not picking up a live stream currently on here. Maybe because we don't have a connection or something's dropped off. Brilliant. Whilst that's just being sorted, Nick, where did this journey begin? I've talked a little bit about the southwest of England, but was yours a sort of an ordinary childhood? But was there anything special when you were younger that sort of started to inspire you to follow this journey?
Well, I think it was growing up on the coastline. So I was always involved in coastal kind of hobbies, outdoors, swimming, that kind of stuff. So yeah. I spent most of my time there, and I think that's what kind of encouraged me into studying marine sciences.
And so you've got this enjoyment of, thank you very much, you've got this enjoyment of the seas, the oceans from your childhood. Where did the science bit come from?
I think it was getting the ID guides and looking at different species in rock pools and in the intertidal zone of the coastlines, and I always wanted to find every single species, so that was always what I enjoyed doing. I think that kind of encouraged the scientific kind of side.
And do you have a favourite rock pool species, these pools that form as the tide goes out?
A favourite? I do quite like the crab. I think the crab, it's quite beefy, it's a bit of a tank, it kind of survives everywhere and anywhere. It really is a generalist. It goes for, it can survive a lot, so quite like that.
Fantastic. And then so you've got this sort of ID spotting guide, this real interest in marine life. Did you then go and study marine biology at university?
No, I studied biological sciences, so I took a broader kind of approach to biology. And then, I was studying a lot of terrestrial biology and sort of general biology before kind of refocusing in on marine biology again.
And you're currently doing something called a Masters by Research. What's involved in that?
It means that my thesis or my project is made up purely by research that I do, so there's no taught element. I come up with a question or a hypothesis, and I try to answer that question.
Perfect. And what is that? What is that question you're trying to answer?
So for me, back at the university I work at, I'm looking at mussels and microplastics and how microplastics in marine sediment and water reflect microplastics in mussels.
Okay. Wow. That sounds like an important piece of research. And then how come you're now in the Arctic doing something that's similar but a little bit different?
Well, it was a great opportunity that was presented to me, and it's really nice to be here and talking to you guys. And why? Because microplastics are in the Arctic, or?
Are they?
Well, it's thought that microplastics, that the Arctic oceans are a sink or a place where microplastics eventually end up. So
Okay.
we think it's important to investigate whether microplastics are making it to pristine habitats like the Arctic.
And how have you been doing that?
So we've been out sampling in the field. We've been using a really fine net to trawl in the surface water and in deep water. And we're looking at how much microplastic we can find in each.
Amazing. So we just show the viewers a little bit of sort of what we've been out sampling, where exactly that is, and to give you a sense of where we are as well. Few bits and bobs right around. So if you could just sort of tell us, maybe come around on this side.
So the ocean is that way, and the field comes into the land up to the glaciers at the end. And we've been sampling at the very end of the field, and in the middle of the field, and also right out towards deeper water as well.
And what does sampling mean?
Sampling. It means that we're taking a smaller amount of something we're taking a small amount of water to assess what's in that small amount of water, so that we can maybe take an estimate of what's here altogether.
Okay, great. And that's using a net, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. So you've been dragging a net through sort of what I can see some sort of bony bits and small icebergs out there. So that must have been quite exciting. Sort of doing sampling around those.
Yeah, we almost got stuck in sea ice on the first day, so we couldn't make it to one of our sites.
And what's it like to be researching in this part of the world?
Amazing, absolutely beautiful. Just to have mountains and glaciers around you, it's a bit distracting at times. Yeah.
But you're not up here sleeping in tents. Where are you based?
We're in research station, which is just behind you, and it's quite comfortable. We've got a lot of resources here to make us comfortable while we study, but at the same time, it's kind of a testing environment when you're out on the boat every day. For a long time, it gets really cold.
Well, before we get too cold outside, let's go back in and see what questions we've got coming through, both those that have been sent in beforehand and those coming through whilst we're online. And you should shut the door, keep the Arctic breeze out there. And great to have the Sharon Robo Knights FLL Robotics from Sharon Elementary School in Georgia. Welcome. I'm looking forward to your questions as well. But we've got we had so many questions from a previous session. We're just going to tackle some of those now. We have Ines Tavernier's class in Belgium, and this is a question from Eden. Are you planning to do more studies about microplastics, and do you investigate other topics and issues as well?
So at the moment I'm full-time plastic study, that takes up all of my time. But the advances in plant microplastics research I think are really starting to take off. So scientists now are asking some really interesting questions when it comes to microplastics.
Well, what kind of things are we talking about here? Because we're focusing on are there any plastics and where might they be? What are some of the more sort of advanced questions or the newer questions that people are talking about?
Well, whether they affect organisms on a larger scale, on a kind of ecosystem scale, and whether they can act as a carrier for diseases, and whether they can. Yeah, so there's quite a few questions being asked.
Wow, and microplastics only, or are you bringing in other topics into your research and your work?
I'm purely microplastics research based.
Fantastic. And a question from Anton. Can you already see any consequences in Svalbard due to microplastics in the ice?
Any consequences? Well, at the moment we're really looking at just if they're here and the distribution of microplastics. We haven't seen, not on this trip, any specific consequences so far. But once we know where these microplastics are here, and we might start investigating the organisms that are having an impact on.
Great. We've got a question coming through here from Mrs. Seymour, but it's Anthony Gell in Worksworth, sorry, would like to ask, what is the next step once your data has been collected?
Okay, so when we've collected our samples, they get placed into a pot and we take them back to the university. Then I will filter them, and then it's using a microscope to start analysing the amount of plastics there. Then I will collect all the microplastics, which is quite a fiddly job. They like to spring around because they're quite static. And then I use another type of microscope, a spectral microscope, to analyse what types of microplastics we have here.
So quite involved, so this is quite a small part of the overall research. Quite exciting, but
yeah, a very small part. The analysis is really the longest part.
Amazing. Going over to India, asking, is there any way to connect with the Indian Research Station, which is just a couple of buildings down? I don't know whether it's staffed at the moment. It may just be working on summer-based research. Different times of year are suited for different types of research, but I can certainly ask later today, maybe over dinner, we can find out how best to connect with the Indian Research Station here in the Olesund. Is your research focused on plastics found on the surface, or also those found deeper?
So while we're here, we are still sampling microplastics on the surface, but we're also sampling microplastics in the deep water, because there's quite a strong separation in the Arctic of the surface water, which is influenced by the melting ice of the glacier, and the deeper waters, which we think come up from the North Atlantic. So we think we've analysed some data that we collected recently, and we know that cutoff is about 160 metres deep. So we're towing a net below 160 metres and also in the surface, so that we can compare them to see the local microplastics and the influx or the import of microplastics from the North Atlantic currents that come up here.
Interesting, really interesting. And a question on communications from student Wan Zhang in China, who wanted to clarify the answer for a question on communications. And apparently I mentioned that we called on the radio, the base radio, and does that mean walkie-talkie, two-way or multi-way? So we use two-way radios up here to communicate. Each station has its own channel, and the reason why a couple of days ago I left the room to go and talk to the research team on the boat was that we have a base radio which has an antenna on the roof, so there's a much better connection rather than these smaller aerials. So literally just getting like moving to a different room to get better reception on your mobile phone. I was just going to use a different radio with better reception, but it's two-way radios that we use to communicate up here. Going to now Big White School in Grand Forks, British Columbia in Canada. What other big field trips or expeditions have you been a part of?
I think this is probably one of my first major expeditions, so it's quite exciting.
And you did a project, is it called Sail for Britain or something like that?
Yeah, Sail Britain. I've also done some microplastics research, again in southwest England on the coast, again sailing a yacht for taking surface tows of microplastics again, and we also sampled some sediments too.
Great. And do you have the results of the discoveries from the Sail Britain work?
I'm still working on those samples as well. Yeah, these samples do take a long time to process.
Brilliant. So you showed us some of those sample bottles a couple of days ago, and it looked like a sort of a green gunk. I couldn't see any plastics in there. What's going on there? Why can't we're up here looking at plastics, and I can't see anything? Does that mean there are no plastics?
No, it will take using a microscope. We need to view at a higher magnification because a especially in the Arctic, the microplastic particles are really small. We think they're mostly under 50 micrometers. A micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter. So we need to take that back to the laboratory to be able to see them. But the green gunk you mentioned is all of the plankton.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, the water here looks really clear, but it's absolutely full of life. As soon as you get the net in, you start scooping up all of these tiny, tiny creatures.
Perfect. You're talking about the distribution, or the amount of microplastics in the Arctic. Can you tell the students a little bit about the sampling technique? We've done the whole sort of demonstration of sampling of the ice. How do you design your sampling methodology?
Okay. Well, it's a bit of a balance of how much time you have here on how many locations you want to sample at. You need to look at your question you're asking. So for us, that means the deep water tows and the surface tows, so we can have that comparison. So we've tried to balance it throughout the field, but while still taking our replications, which you might have seen in the workshop you did earlier with the sea ice and the peppercorns.
Brilliant. So, I mean, how many different sampling sites have you visited?
So we visited 7 sampling sites
Okay.
in all while here, and we've done deep water tows at 3 of those sites. We didn't find that the water was separated enough closer to the glaciers to be able to do it at those sites.
Okay, interesting. And question coming here, we talk a lot about the scientific method, about microplastics, about your journey to the Arctic. This is a question that's come up quite a lot, is what can be done to minimise the impact of microplastics on marine life?
Well, I think it's about preventing them from entering the marine environment in the first place.
Okay.
So I think it's about reducing the amount of single-use plastics and improving our recycling, waste management to prevent them from entering the marine environment.
Okay.
Once they're in the marine environment, it's quite difficult to remove them or to reduce the impact on marine life.
And sort of following up from that, we're talking about microplastics in marine life and probably quite pervasive in other parts of our life too. Are we eating microplastics?
Are we eating them? I think it depends really what type of in seafood. Yes, it depends what type. If you're looking at the organisms which we eat whole, like small fish like sprats or mussels, the invertebrate, then there are some microplastics in them. But then there's also research to suggest that we do also take in a lot of microplastics just from breathing.
Wow.
So it's difficult to say whether that has an impact.
And so then when we sort of potentially eat a mussel, when we also eat that microplastic, what effect can that have on human health if it does have an effect?
Well, we're not really sure if how much an effect that eating microplastics can have, but it's definitely something that we shouldn't be eating. So yeah,
it's not food.
It's not food. Yeah, but yeah.
Okay. But an emerging area of research.
It's an emerging area of research. Yeah,
okay.
They do contain chemicals that we do know are disruptors of hormone pathways in the body. Whether they can deliver a high enough amount compared to other sources, that's the question.
Okay, great. Now switching over and taking some questions from Sharon Elementary School in Georgia. Are you trying to remove microplastics from the oceans?
So no, not personally. We're not trying to remove them because they're quite spread out. They're still really dispersed. So it's a lot of effort to try to remove microplastics. And as I mentioned before, I think preventing them entering in the first place is the best option.
And that was from Spencer from SU. I mean, this is a robotics class. Again, a question about removing it and using robotics, but maybe we can broaden that out into what kind of use could there be for robotics in researching or generally learning more about plastics?
Oh, I'm not sure on robotics, to be honest.
But is there anything we can automate? Could we send a glider, for instance, up and down the fjord, something?
I'm not sure really. I think we've looked at, before we've questioned using algorithms to analyse filters so that you could make them easier to, you could make it faster to process samples using, you know, image analysis softwares. But that's something that I haven't managed to get into yet. So,
Ellie, you're involved in using new technologies to look at microplastics or plastics rather than microplastics. If you shout out to me, then I'd probably relay back to Georgia.
So we've used drones and new technology with an algorithm that's designed to detect plastics on surfaces like seaweed, sand, rocks. So we can fly a drone over a beach and use it to automatically detect plastics, but that's large plastic pieces. We're not at the accuracy level yet of sub-centimetre, but eventually, hopefully, we will be.
So that's a project using drone technology to identify larger pieces of plastic on sort of coastal areas. So even if there's seaweed there, rocks there, the technology can still distinguish, and that helps to basically to count and to observe the sort of the spread of plastic pollution across coastal areas. Probably much easier than walking around the coast of various countries. Much easier than walking around the coasts. We have here from what types of technology do you use for your experiments? I mean, you know, we talked about it's quite that's quite difficult to see, and B, if you do see something, how do you know it's plastic? And then how do you know what type of plastic it is?
So we analyse it with a spectrometer. It's a microscope where you can focus in on a really small area, such as a microplastic, and it will fire an infrared laser, and it will measure the absorption spectrum. It will produce a spectra, which we compare to other libraries of previously known substances. So we can compare our samples with previously known substances like plastic polymers, so that we can figure out what our sample contains and what it's made of.
Wow, so there you go, microscopes with infrared lasers. Wow. Lasers. Fantastic. And we have Manuela Correa joining us again. Wonderful to have you back. One of the things I'm really interested in Nick, is that we have this problem and we have this desire coming through from a lot of our students to do something, and the immediate desire is wanting to sort of almost sift through the ocean and take all the plastics out. You've been saying that's not probably the best way of doing it. Apart from it being difficult, and we shouldn't discount things for being difficult, are there any other reasons why you think we should be focusing more on the sort of where plastics are coming from?
No, well, I think you can definitely make a difference by your choices in what you buy and what you consume, because a huge proportion of plastic we find on the beach, which goes on to break down into microplastics, is from plastic packaging, from consumer products and food wrappings, and cosmetics and things like that. So I think you can definitely you could make a difference by your choices in purchasing.
And is it just individuals who are having to make these choices?
No, I think it's got to be ended top and bottom, really. We need to try to purchase things with less plastic, but at the same time, if you try to go plastic free, you'll realise it's really difficult to, because it's not really catered for. The plastic is on everything, so yeah.
So maybe one of the things that students can do is to look at where they can reduce that plastic use in their lives, and especially single-use plastics, but also potentially ask parents, schools, political representatives also sort of what they can do.
I think there's plenty of options for things that we use in our everyday lives that we can replace with non-plastic, like plastic bags can be replaced with reusable bags. Plastic straws don't really need to be used altogether. We have biodegradable straws, using reusable water bottles, things like that.
Fantastic. And also, this is your first time in the Arctic.
Yeah.
How have you found it so far?
It's been useful. It's been really nice. It's been, being out on the boat and being able to get out into further locations and see see the mountains and glaciers has been amazing, really. But it's been cold as well. Out on the boat for 7 or 8 hours, you do really start to feel the cold.
Oof, that sounds, and particularly when you're on the water and you've got that sort of dampness in the air. Because dry cold, not too bad, but the wet cold really gets into your bones.
It's difficult to hold scientific equipment when you can't feel your fingers.
And so, I mean, that must be quite challenging. What are the other challenges of working up in New Orleans in this sort of remote and sort of isolated part of the world?
Well, I think it's the fact that it's isolated. So if you do break something or you haven't brought something with you, then there's really no replacement unless somebody else has something with them too. So, for example, yesterday we planned a full day of science, and we wanted to collect all of the samples that we had left. And on the first tow, the winch of the boat broke. So that meant reprioritising, and we collected only maybe a third of what we had planned to.
But a good news story in the end. I know heard that the team at the Marine Lab and here at Kings Bay in New Orleans have been working sort of like double shifts pretty well to make everything happen.
So they fixed the winch. We've got a second winch now, and
amazing.
The rest of the team collected all of the samples today. So
a setback, sort of facing up to that challenge and finding solutions.
Yeah.
Wow. And talked a little bit about sort of how you found the art. What kind of wildlife, if someone came up here, because we talk about microplastics and its impact on the marine environment, what kind of wildlife and animals could be affected by marine plastics here in Svalbard?
Well, we find marine plastics in so many different types of organisms, whether it's invertebrates, we found them in marine mammals, we find them in fish, we find them in seabirds as well. And this is a really rich environment. So we know that the plankton, the microplastics are in the same sort of areas that the plankton inhabit too. And we have evidence from the lab at least that microplastics are eaten by plankton. And we worry that it might be passed up the food chain to larger organisms who are consuming the smaller ones.
And some of those larger organisms here, you spotted?
The one we saw yesterday, the walrus, which I think has definitely been the wildlife highlight for me, I think, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. And wondering if you could share just a sense of what life is like here. We saw the UK Arctic Research Station, when we were outside. What's a day in the life of Nick Scott in the Arctic?
Well, it depends, because if we want to have a good sampling day, then we typically prepare everything the night before, and then we'll wake up and have a quick breakfast. All of the meals are communal because there are multiple research stations here from all over the world, so we all eat in a mess hall. Then we prepare lunch, and then we're out on the water all day sampling, so maybe 8-9 hours, depending on how long we can stay out in the boat for. We're sampling all day.
Wow, does it get hungry out there?
We take lots of biscuits.
Biscuit-powered exploration of the Arctic Ocean. Great to have CC Carruthers Public School in London, Ontario, joining us again. Great to have you back, and great to have a grade 6 class coming. Absolutely fantastic there. And just looking again at that day in the life piece. How do you think this will change you, this experience in the Arctic?
Oh, I think it's given me the bug for remote places. I think definitely. I think I'll keep pushing to go to even wilder, even more remote places than this, if that's possible.
Maybe yes, you come up here to the most northerly permanent settlement in the world. So, but I'm sure if you just headed on that way, I think the North Pole is a few hundred miles just out of the door if you kept on going. We've got a question here from Canada. The first question from Melissa: what is your favourite part of researching in the Arctic?
Oh, I think the scenery, for one. It's a little bit distracting at times, but being able to look up and see a mountain behind you is definitely a benefit. And I think also talking to all of you guys too. I think that's definitely been a highlight. I think being able to communicate my research to lots of different people is really amazing.
Brilliant. We've actually got a piece on the robotics side. We have a solution to remove microplastics from our water treatment plants in the treatment plant there is a sand filtration tank, and they're planning to place the electronic microplastic cleaner there. This is a little bit of that within our wastewater there are these microfibers, and these other pieces of plastic waste can get into that. We talked about not cleaning up the ocean, but there are things you can do before it gets to the ocean, and what kind of things can be done to stop wastewater coming to the ocean with microfibers.
So yeah, I think it's a great idea because although it's quite a small fraction of microplastics that enter wastewater, so there's also so one of the main types of microplastic you find around coasts are microfibers, which come from synthetic clothing, and they're released when you wash them, and they go into wastewater systems. And quite a lot, the majority of this is removed by our water treatment methods already. But there is still that small amount that enters the marine environment, and because we produce such huge amounts and process such huge amounts of water, that does have an impact. So I think that's a great idea to focus on.
And they're going to use this electronic microplastic cleaner. It's going to drive over the sand and use optical sensors to find and remove microplastics. What kind of challenges? I mean, we're talking about I'm not going to pin you down on the optical sensors. But what kind of sizes are we talking about that those sensors would have to pick up?
So they range from, most are about 500 micrometers in size and smaller, so it's really small.
So that's sort of half a millimeter down to
about 10 micrometers is, I think, about the detectable limit for us at the moment.
Wow. So you've got to definitely have an electronics challenge there to get those sensors detecting particles that small and distinguishing them from the sand.
Yeah.
Wow, so good luck in Georgia. Next question from Tilla. Have you ever found yourself in a dangerous situation while in the field conducting your research, natural hazards, animals, that kind of thing?
I think some of the places that we're studying are quite changeable. I think especially when you're in a tidal region and you're sampling in the water, so you're out in the sea, and especially in the UK, the tidal changes are really fast. So you've got to be careful that you're not distracted by your scientific method and your sampling, and not watching the hazards around you. And it's similar with the boat as well, I think, because there's so many moving parts and things going on. You've got to remember that you're in a location like this, you're in a dangerous location, while also trying to do your science.
Amazing. And the second day you were here, you were involved in some pretty specialised training for this part of the world.
Oh yeah, yeah, polar bears. Probably the most interesting, the best field hazard that I've encountered. So we had rifle training on the second day that we were here, and also polar bear management training. So using flare guns to try and scare polar bears away. So that was a lot of fun, yeah.
And how did you do up at the range?
I did very well.
Compared to the rest of the team?
You did very well.
You did very well.
I did well, but I think the rest of the team were really good. I think Clara, who you've spoken to before, was the best shot. So yeah, I think she'll get the gun if it came to that.
Okay, good to know. I think Clara's just in the station, so good to know we have crack shot on station at the moment.
Not that we want to shoot polar bears.
No, I mean just to be, serious about these things. You never want it to get to that point where you have a polar bear encounter where a bear needs to be shot. So you're very, very right pointing out that if we are out in the field, not necessarily on a boat, but potentially going up to a glacier site, then you do have a flare pistol as well as a rifle, and the flare pistol very, very important to use if you think there's a polar bear close by. I think we fired a flare last year. There's a really, really poor visibility, and there did seem to be a shape coming through the blizzard. And better to be safe than sorry. Sort of fired the flare off, and then came back down and then went out again to see if we could find any tracks. We didn't find any tracks, but it was snowing quite heavily. So who knows whether that was a polar bear or something else. Great, we have Riley here. So now, at the beginning of your research career, have you ever discovered anything of historical significance?
Historical significance. Oh, I think that's for other people to decide rather than me.
But I mean, we have at school science, we have these big figures, these sort of Newtons and Einsteins and Faradays and other names that that we learn about and inferring people's laws, whether it be Boyle or Hooke or somebody else. But science tends to be very collaborative now, and it's sort of teams putting this work together. So, do you think that we'll see fewer of these big names and more sort of people talk about teams that have done things?
I think probably, yeah, because science is so specialised now. I think it takes the work of so many people to answer certain questions, and it's all about building on each other's work rather than building your own body of work so much. I think things are more team-based. So while we're here in the Arctic, we're also laying down the foundations for other researchers' work as well. We're putting out settlement units for another researcher back in the UK. Okay. And yeah, so it's all a big collaborative project.
So I mean, you've talked about pieces of a jigsaw before. Can you explain that metaphor a bit more about the work we do relating to a bigger picture?
Well, I think you can only ask a really small part. So I think what we do is we ask questions, and we create these hypotheses or ideas, and we try to answer them. But you can't. I think when you look at it on a much larger scale, when you do an analysis of all of the findings of scientists, it's when you start to find emerging trends and the answers to the really big questions.
Okay. We've got a few questions coming through from St. Ignatius Catholic School in Meridian, Idaho. What are you planning to do after finishing your Masters, and will that include future expeditions?
Oh, I'm not sure yet. I think I wanted just to take some time out, and I really want to go to British Columbia. I think that's the next place for me to go. I think they've got some amazing wildlife, amazing scenery, so I think I'll be travelling there. But no plans as of yet.
Fantastic. So, and I think we've had some schools in British Columbia.
I think we have, yeah.
So maybe
I wanted to give them a
yes, drop in and give a talk on your way through. In 20 years' time, what do you think our oceans will look like?
Oh, that's a big question. I think it really depends on how we act today and how we address the challenges that the ocean face. I think that's
sort of up to us, really.
I think it's up to us, yeah.
And up to us on an individual level and on a national and a governmental level.
I think it's how fast we can change to address these problems. I think will really affect what kind of situation we end up with in the future.
Really? Do you think we know enough to start taking the right action now?
I think so, yeah. I think we need to keep asking questions, and we need to make sure that our efforts are targeted in the right places. But yeah, I think we know enough definitely to make choices, to make decisions on how to act to impact the natural world.
Brilliant. And this is a question sort of looking back at what it is like to be a scientist, to be a researcher. Out of your sort of a typical year, what proportion of that is spent in the field and what proportion of that is spent in the lab?
I think it really depends on how much you're researching, how much data you're collecting. I spend quite a lot of, so each project or thesis, hypothesis is broken down into sections. So I'll have one component will be field-based, and it will be collecting my data from the environment. And then I go on to the analysis, which is spent entirely in the lab almost, or a computer. So I have that, and then we go on to writing up our methods. So it's about equal proportions, I think, into those three parts.
Brilliant. And that sort of leads on to a question we've had through from Connor in London, Ontario. How long have we been here for, and what's our stay?
We've been here for 2 weeks, haven't we? I think just under 2 weeks, yeah. We're here for a few more days.
Brilliant. And Connor also wants to know how long is a typical stay. It can be anything between sort of 2 weeks and 2 years, depending on the project that you're doing. So really depending on the project. we've come here to collect some samples, some trawling samples and some water samples to look at the impact of human activity on the fjord. As Nick said, if we had longer, we might be able to measure different parts of the fjord, maybe down at the sediment, maybe some of the outlet from the station to see if that's a source of microplastics. So there's plenty of other work to be doing here, and I think this is the beginning of a 3-year project with the Arctic Live research expedition. We've got some great work being done, commentary from Georgia on their way to a robotic arm scraping microplastics to be recycled. This is a lot of innovation here. If it works in wastewater, is this something that we can look at for deployment in the ocean? These kind of technological solutions? Or is the ocean too big?
I think the ocean is a really big place, but I think it would take a bit of everything. I think it's great that we're kind of developing or trying to develop these tools. I think you need a lot of tools in your kind of armory to be able to tackle these problems. So yeah, I think it's a good area of interest.
Easier to do it at the wastewater point than taking it.
So I think it's much easier to do it at the source because the ocean is a huge place, and though we talk about the garbage patches and these huge areas where they're concentrated, they're not just big islands of plastic. They're quite spread out too as well. So I think it takes a lot of effort to be able to remove from the ocean. I think stopping at the source is definitely the easiest way.
And that's why we need the scientific evidence from researchers like yourself to be able to tell us where are our efforts best focused. That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much. We've got one more question coming through from Livingston High School. A question from a teacher. In the US, we constantly struggle with how best to teach science. What practical skills are going to prepare kids best for this kind of field work?
I think being able to come up with your own methods to answer the question is probably the best thing. I think to have an overall hypothesis, but to allow people to develop their own way to answer that question. I think being able to think kind of critically about the best ways to approach a question that needs to be asked is maybe the best way.
I always feel there's a bit MacGyver up here, that you don't know the best way of doing something doesn't quite work, and you hitch this to this and a bit of string around here. And I think we've been searching for bits of chain on the beach that might be from 50 years ago to weigh down something to make something work. I always feel there's the science skills, which you talk about, the sort of methodology piece, and then there's the just make things work with what you've got side.
I think it's not having an almost dictionary-like knowledge of all science. It's about how you approach a question and how you go about answering a question and thinking about that.
And that's probably quite tricky in our sort of standards and curriculum-driven and test-driven sort of school environment at the moment. And maybe come back to the importance of doing field work at school. Did you do biology field work at school?
Yeah, I did. We used to do different ecological surveys and species diversity counts, and I think that's definitely something that really interested me, because seeing something in a book is totally different to being out somewhere looking at it for real. So I think that's these practical skills of identification and analysis in your local area are really important.
And that's something you don't have to go on a massive expedition to the Arctic. You can do it on the school grounds even. You can start to relate how different species prefer different places, or if changes in conditions are affecting the species abundance or distribution.
Yeah, I just think coming up with observational kind of projects is definitely a good thing to do.
Here we are, and we have, I think this is our final question from Kased. How many wild animals have you encountered in the field, i.e. none, a few, or lots?
Loads. I think there's life everywhere. Especially if you start to look small scale as well, you'll see it's just absolutely everywhere. In the intertidal regions where I study, there's so much opportunity, and it's a really chaotic environment, a chaotic habitat that it takes a lot of organisms and a lot of strength to kind of hang on and be able to survive there. So Yeah, and I mean, just here, there's so much wildlife. I think we're a bit too early for the whales, so we haven't seen them. But we did hear that there were polar bear footprints on the other side of the fjord a few days ago, and the walrus and seals and loads of different birds. So you're always exposed to different animals and organisms in the field.
Amazing. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us as part of Axel Kaplan Arctic Live. Do tune in an hour or so as we have the final session for the day, an open Q&A. And then tomorrow we have a live investigation looking at the impact of melting ice on sea level rise. We have an interview with Ellie Mackay, and that will be repeated both for our European and North American audiences. So thanks so much for tuning in, and for now it's a goodbye from the Arctic. Bye bye.